Welcome back to the Messy City podcast. Happy to have you here and listening. Again, I really appreciate everybody who hits that like or follow button. And if you have the opportunity to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen, that is most appreciated. It really helps the podcast rankings and just gets it a little more traction in the world so that more and more people will be able to hear this. So I thank you all for listening and for helping out in any way you can. And as always, if you have any messages for me, suggestions, comments, critiques, whatever, please do email me. It's not hard to find me. You can find a link off the Substack page, which is it's actually, if you just Google the Messy City on Substack or Kevin Klinkenberg on Substack, it's very easy to find. There are not many Kevin Klinkenbergs out there. So thanks for paying attention. As I record this today, it's October 13th. It's actually Friday the 13th. And it's the time of year when things, I guess, are getting focused on Halloween and spooky stuff, but it's also a time when there's a lot of very sobering and tragic news in the world. And I don't mean to ignore any of that, but I think what I'd like to do here today is actually try to take your mind off of it and focus on a few other things. And so what I have here today are three topic areas that have been front of mind for me, and from which I've had some direct experience this summer, this fall, that I wanted to share, and all relate to the world of placemaking and different aspects of what is happening, and places also where people are doing some good things, and some areas where I think there are a lot of questions to be had about what our priorities are. So the first thing I wanted to bring up, first chapter here is last week I had the opportunity to attend the annual International Downtown Association conference. I think I mentioned this in a previous episode that IDA is sort of the trade organization for groups like Midtown KC Now, where I'm the executive director, or your local downtown association. If you're in certainly at least a medium-sized city, you probably have a downtown association of some kind. And they generally belong to IDA and participate. So about 1,500 people got together this year in Chicago. Always good to talk with colleagues that are working in the world of place management and share tips and tricks. Although I will say I'm at an age and a point in my life now where I'm getting a little conferenced out, and I don't enjoy these as much as I used to when I was in my 30s, say. But it's still good to connect with people and learn when you can. I think one of the interesting things, again, I wanted to emphasize, I had a previous episode where I talked about what we do with Midtown KC Now and the importance of place management. When you get together with other colleagues and see people doing it around the country, it really does reveal how much incredible experimentation there is going on at the local level in regards to public space management and place management. And there's a pretty broad variety in what these organizations do and focus on. And I guess that really shouldn't be a surprise because they grow out of whatever is important in that community or that neighborhood. So like, for example, in our community where I work, our focus is really a clean and safe program. And that's really what our constituents are looking for. They're looking for extra attention for security operations, for cleanliness in the public space, and for improving public space with beautification. There are others that you visit that may focus entirely on public space beautification, and that's really the 80 or 90% of what they do, and very small proportion, say, on security. And then, of course, there are the opposite. There are others that really focus primarily on security because that's the need, and less so on physical improvements. So, and again, there's even more beyond that. You can find these organizations that undertake master plans for the future, that get involved with design and development issues. I think one of the things that I would say to my fellow designers, people in the planning and urban design world, what really interests me is how little overlap I see at these conferences between people who work in design and planning and people who actually work in place management. And I feel like that's an incredible missed opportunity. So I hope over time we can find ways for these groups to connect. Years ago, when I was really cutting my teeth and learning a lot about the world of urban design and community planning, uh, like many people, I learned a lot from Liz Plater-Zyberg, the PZ of DPZ co-design. And one of the things that Liz used to talk about all the time is that this act of what we call community building is really a three-legged stool that's composed of design, policy, and management. And I have long felt that we have far too much emphasis on policy. And by that, I mean we have too many really smart, capable people thinking about policy and not nearly enough on management. And also, frankly, throughout my career, I felt like not nearly enough on design. It felt like there's probably been, maybe let's call it 70% emphasis on policy, 20% on design, and 10% on management. And in the real world, what's incredibly important is management and the human side of making sure that a place is cared for, that you have people that are out there doing the work every day. One of the things in my own community that I have belabored, and certainly others have talked about endlessly, is that we can always find money to build something, whatever it is, some public improvement, especially the larger the improvement. In some ways, it feels like it's much easier to find the money to get it done. So let's say we're going to do a $50 million park. We can create a bond issue and a campaign and some sexy renderings and get that done. And, many cities are able to accomplish those sorts of things. What we are not very good at is establishing systems and sources of money to maintain them. And even when there is sources of funding to maintain them, just not being on the ball on a regular basis to make sure whatever we build is clean, it's attractive, it's obviously well cared for, and that's a shame because that without that, then you really won't have the kinds of places and communities that you would like to have. And so I find it's unfortunate that we spend so much time talking about policy. You could have the best policy in the world, but if you don't have people on the ground who know how to execute, manage, and maintain a place, then none of it matters. And by the same token, you can have really great design in a really well-designed public space. But if somebody isn't there to maintain it or manage it, it's going to go bad and fairly quickly. So all three of these areas are incredibly important: design, policy, and management. And the best place is really seek a balance in those and really find a way to emphasize how each can play a positive role. And so the cool thing about going to an IDA conference is you really get to see the management side of things very well, because there has been this, incredible growth in the place management world over the last 20 and 30 years. And, let's be honest, that's because a lot of cities just don't manage public space very well for a variety of reasons that we could all discuss and debate. But especially in larger cities, there just is not very good public space management. That's very common. And so people in their own neighborhoods or mini communities will create these organizations so that they can get the attention that they feel is really needed in their area. And so now there are these hundreds of organizations all over, not just the United States, but Canada, United Kingdom, and other countries. And it's really a pretty cool thing to see. And I think there's a lot to be learned here about what is effective at the block and neighborhood scale. and probably a bunch of lessons learned when we think about the notion of subsidiarity and how we might need to reinvent our local government over time. Uh, we're in a period right now where there's a ton of reinvention going on across society in a lot of different ways. And I think it's a great time to start to ask ourselves very challenging questions about how things are managed. It sure seems in our area that resources are stretched thinner than they've ever been. Staffing is tremendously hard on just about every business or industry or that I talk to, and so there's a lot of questions being asked about how people can maintain their core services and do it to a high level. And that's leading to, I think, a lot of interesting thinking that is reinventing industries, business, nonprofits, government, you name it. And there's a ton of that really needs to happen at the local government level as well. So I think there's immense amount of lessons that can be learned from place management organizations that deal directly with problems with people and problems at a very small scale. So if you haven't, if you're in the urban design world or planning world and you haven't heard of IDA or participated, I would encourage you to look them up. Uh, Maybe get connected with an organization that is participating with them, and think about ways that you can connect with people who are doing the day-to-day work on the ground. Next year, IDA will be in Seattle, and so anybody on the West Coast who's really interested in this and not familiar, I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's a very, very cool group of people, very interesting what is going on, and everything from very small towns to the largest cities in North America participate. So there's really a little bit of something for everyone. Okay, chapter 2. There's a little bit of a tie-in to that topic here. We'll see how well I'm able to connect the two, but I may have mentioned before. I've talked about the struggles that I see happening with our kids' school related to buses and to finding bus drivers and busing. Now, there's a lot of layers to this. I would, by the way, note that I see this problem written about and talked about for virtually every school and school district in the country right now. So this is not like a hyper local concern. There is a shortage of people who are frankly just qualified to drive a school bus out there. And there's a tremendous need. And many schools are struggling. Our school, in particular, almost daily sends out alerts about certain routes that are just not covered because they didn't have a driver. And it's a huge challenge. Obviously, if you can't get kids to school, they can't learn. And so it's an enormous issue in education right now. And our school has even just taken on some debt to buy some buses and set up their own bus system, but they still have to get the drivers, and it's a huge challenge. It's a big frustration. We're fortunate that our kids don't rely on the bus service, at least at the age we are now, and how we're able to deal with them. We're kind of shuttling them around ourselves, but for many families, they absolutely rely on the bus service. And there's a ton of problems with that, with not being able to have reliable on-time service. And I see our school board struggling with it. I see many school boards struggling with this. So there's one great aspect that I know has been talked about in the Strong Towns world, which is, some of this is a side effect of 50 years of decision making that schools have made to essentially put schools in locations where kids can't walk to school, and that's absolutely a part of it. If you're my age or older, I'm 53. If you're my age or older, there's a pretty good chance that you walked to school either elementary or junior high, middle school, more likely than not that you walk to school. Whether you lived in a small town or a big city, that was probably the case. If you're younger than me, it's more likely than not that you didn't walk to school. And that's because of a whole shift in policy and design. There we are back again to my design, policy, and management three-legged stool. But there was a major shift in the thinking about how schools should be designed, where they should be located, and really the approach to education in general, which really pushed larger and larger schools. In let's say 100 years ago, schools generally were much smaller than they are today, especially at the elementary school level, and they were really embedded in neighborhoods. And so the vast majority of kids walked to school. And as we shifted to a culture where more and more people drive a car to get to their destination for just about everything, we also changed the educational model so that the schools got bigger and bigger. I have friends who have joked that basically schools are sized based on the most expensive piece of janitorial equipment. And there's probably some truth to that. It became more a function of efficiency of operations than anything. And so a lot of elementary schools now, and for years, have been what they call 4-section schools, which basically means there are 4 classes at every grade level. And that means the schools themselves are larger and larger. This paralleled a major change that happened in rural America and small towns where schools were consolidated. And so whereas almost every tiny little town in the country used to have its own school, even if that was like a one-room schoolhouse or just a very small building. For example, my dad's school in Baser, Kansas. Baser at the time was a town of about 600 people. They had their own school. And I know I'm going to get this wrong, but I think in his graduating class in 1953, there were about 12 kids or so in his graduating class, maybe 15, 16. It's in that ballpark. So there were very small classes, but the school was the heart and soul of those communities. And we embarked on a policy really driven from the top down to say that those schools were not efficient. They were too small, and we needed to consolidate schools. And so many small towns lost their school. And even schools that used to be out more in the rural areas, not necessarily even in towns, were closed. And you would have a county that would end up with just one school system very often in a lot of rural communities. One of the effects of all that is you had a lot more kids now in transportation time that didn't used to be, because whereas they might have been able to walk to a school in their town, now they're going on a bus to a consolidated school somewhere else. So to use my dad's town as an example again, that school district or that school consolidated with another nearby small town that was probably, I'm going to say, 10 to 15 miles away, called Linwood. And they became the Baser Linwood high school, or Baser Linwood district. So the high school, now those kids are all the kids who were in Linwood and nearby to Linwood were all bused to Baser because that's where the school is. And the combined high school was built at the time on what was more of the edge of Baser. So it was not in the heart of the community anymore. And made it difficult even for the kids in Baser to walk there. And all the kids from the other outlying areas were bused there. So we had this major change in educational philosophy and management that had a dramatic impact on how kids get to and from school. And so we had where school busing used to be a fairly minor percentage of kids. It has now become a majority in a lot of places. And so that's obviously driven a huge demand and a need for buses and bus drivers. It's also created an enormous expense for a lot of schools and school districts. Transportation is a huge expense on the education side. And it's a challenge. There are obviously many other spinoff effects which people have written about for years, which include the fact that there's a whole lot of small towns that once they lost their school, they just like withered up and died. And frankly, there's a lot of urban neighborhoods that experienced a similar fate because urban school districts used to have smaller neighborhood schools in their neighborhoods. And once those schools were closed and consolidated into larger schools, it had a terrible impact on the glue that held those neighborhoods together. Even if those neighborhoods were poor and struggling, the kids all went to school together. They walked there. The families knew each other. And when you lost that bond, it's a real killer to a lot of communities. There's no two ways around it. So um, that kind of brings us to today, and now we have this system where there's a majority of kids who are bused to school, and we have an entirely separate bus system just for school kids in basically everywhere in the country. And we obviously do this because we care about the safety of our kids, and we want them to have something dedicated to the schools. And it was one of those things that just kind of seemed like a good idea at the time, but has metastasized in ways that I'm sure were not planned or thought of when school busing started to become a thing. Originally, we started busing kids to school in any real way in the 1920s. And I guess that really shouldn't be a surprise because that's the era when a whole lot of things started to change in how we plan, built, and interact in our society. That was the era when we started to see mass ownership of automobiles. That was the era when we shifted to more of a quote unquote professional management of city governments. And sort of the creation of an administrative apparatus that did not really exist before in a meaningful way. In the city planning and development world, that's when we started to institute zoning ordinances, parking requirements, when we started to have much more concerted effort to socialize transportation costs and build large amounts of infrastructure. That's really the era when everything changed. And one of the things that I find fascinating and where I wanted to get to with all this is it's been about 100 years since we did all of that, since we had this really major shift in society in so many ways. And something that's occurred to me that I haven't written about before, but I'd like to at some point, is it feels like in many ways what we are experiencing in our society now and have been over the last 10 or 15 years is a gradual and sort of herky-jerky, painful return to how we used to do things before that shift in the 19 teens and 20s in society. And we did a lot because we entered a period of time where we had a lot of wealth and we had new shiny objects that we thought we could redesign society around. And it's taken a long time. And I think, to be frank, a lot of those things just haven't worked out very well for us. And whether you're talking about how we rebuilt the entire way we interact in cities around driving, to how we manage our cities and the policy we created for cities, there's an awful lot that is in question now. And I think you can see where there are cases where we are adapting very naturally back to that's to an era that was similar to the pre-1920s era. And there are other areas where we are kind of being forced back into it. And I think the school busing example to me is one area where we're being forced back into doing something different. Um, I, I, I cannot see for the life of me how our current situation is sustainable at all from a economics, just from a purely economic standpoint of busing kids to school. Um, I just don't think we're going to, from everything I observe, we're not going to find a way out of this labor shortage issue anytime soon, if ever. And if we do, there will be enormous cost to it that will completely drain away the money that is needed to educate our kids. So I suspect we're going to have to get much more creative and do things differently than what we have been doing them the last several decades. And let me just give you one example of what I mean by that. Years ago, in the Kansas City Star, they used to have this, they had a weekly news magazine on Sunday that was just called Star Magazine, where they had different kinds of stories that were a lot of like feel-good stories and things. And they used to have a column at the back that was basically like somebody, they would ask somebody who to write a short column of something from their youth. And so these were often people who were older who would write columns of what it was like when they grew up in Kansas City years ago or in this area. And they were always really kind of sweet, interesting little stories, just, 5 or 6 paragraphs long. And I don't know why, but I always used to read them. I thought they were interesting. Just the voices of people kind of telling their own stories. And one of the things that was remarkable was, um, Kansas City, like many American cities, had a very extensive streetcar system all the way up until the mid 1950s when it was really dismantled in favor of buses. And for all the people who wrote these stories of their time growing up in, say, the 19 teens through the 1940s, they all would talk about how they used to, as children, ride the streetcars everywhere, often on their own. And many of them rode the streetcars to and from school. And it really got me to thinking that, it really is bizarre in a lot of ways that we have this, we have a bus system for adults and a bus system for kids. And it feels like the kind of luxury that a very, very wealthy society has, but one that is getting increasingly pinched for money is not going to be able to afford. So I can certainly imagine a scenario where we find ways to manage this situation differently by having kids ride the city bus service with some adult supervision and assistance. And it's something I've kind of kicked around a little bit, and I'll probably write this out in a proposal a little bit more. I think there are some other cities that have experimented with this. Minneapolis comes to mind. That I think I've seen an article several years ago where they started working in this area by having kids ride the city buses. But it just feels like a situation we have that can't go on very longer. And in many ways, again, this feels like maybe part of what's happening is we've exhausted what's possible with how we tried to reinvent society 100 years ago. And we're in a time period where we're going to reboot and look back at some of the ways that we used to do things. And obviously, not everything we did well or was right or good 100 years ago. But we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater in that era and tried to invent, the new modern utopian way of life. And there are aspects of that worked out nicely. There's a lot of it that created enormous problems and problems that don't have good solutions today. Like, for example, on the busing deal, I can imagine a scenario where in our part of the city that we could come up with a system that would work pretty well for our kids riding city buses with adults supervising them and getting them to and from school. I can imagine how that happens because we live in the part of the city where there actually is ubiquitous bus service, and the kids who go to our school all live within that area. That's not going to be the case in suburban areas where there just is almost no bus service, or certainly no routine bus service. And so different solutions are going to have to be found there. But it's hard for me to imagine that the current scenario we have will work. By the same token, I think there's a lot of things related to life in 2023 and things that really don't also feel sustainable for a variety of reasons, and ways that we're looking back to what our grandparents and great grandparents did and said, maybe they had some, they did some things right. Maybe we shouldn't have thrown out all those things at once. And I've talked about this before when I talk about just how we consume food, how we cook and consume food. And there is, a very common line today that is basically say, eat like your grandparents ate, because they may have been poor, but they probably ate food that came from ingredients that they could identify. And knowing exactly where the food comes from, what it actually is, that those things are better for us. And they're better than the mass-produced, industrialized junk that is so common for us in our world today and has been for 50 or 60 years. There's a lot of things that I think relate to that are good for us to think about and are changing in many ways, changing back to a previous era, a long forgotten era. So I'm curious, as I talk about this, what's your experience? Send me a note, send me an email, and if we get a good amount of responses, I'll put together a blog post and include them. I'm curious, two things. What do you think about this notion of cities having completely separate bus services for adults and kids? Do you think that's sustainable in today's world? And what do you think about what is changing today in our world that starts to resemble a little bit more of how life may have been, say, in 1910, as opposed to how it is today and how it has been? The last thing I want to talk about today is just a little bit more on thinking about rural areas and small towns. We had the experience recently. We had the opportunity to go spend some time riding the Katy Trail in central Missouri, which is a Rails to Trails project. Really, really wonderful, wonderful trail that goes across the entire state of Missouri. There's a section of it that goes along the Missouri River near Columbia that's especially beautiful. And we went out there and rode back and forth on a long stretch, and then spent the night out in a small town in central Missouri called Boonville, and had a really incredible time. And it's the sort of thing that if you are lucky enough to be able to get away and do something like that, there are some really incredible places you can see and visit. And it's just really great to get out into nature a little bit, to ride your bike, to breathe the fresh air, and spend some time in places you may not go to. And one of the things that you start to see, on trails like this that have existed for a little while, is how some of the smaller towns or places along the route have reoriented a lot of their activity to cater to trail riders, because it's actually become a really great economic development tool for them. And I thought about this because at the same time as we are writing this trail, this Rails to Trails project, which, I mean, it was certainly a project, and there are parts of it that have an expense to it. There are bridges over rivers and other things that cost some real money. But we're talking about, the width of a gravel bike trail, that a lot of these improvements are comparatively inexpensive. At the same time this is going on, the state of Missouri is looking to spend uh, over $1 billion, maybe $2 billion, to widen Interstate 70 across the state from 4 lanes to 6 lanes, the entire length of the state. And it really strikes me as it's another example of how we just get so stuck in our thinking about what is the purpose of transportation expenditures, and what is the point of investing for economic development. This interstate already exists. Adding a couple lanes to it does not make it reach a single community that isn't already along its route. So, in a sense, it's just something that engineers would call a capacity improvement. I've driven this route God knows how many times. The idea that you need 6 lanes of freeway through the heart of Missouri is frankly ludicrous. There are large sections where there's just not much traffic at all. And even when there is some traffic, it's just not a big deal. So it's the kind of project that we just seem to keep doing out of nothing more than inertia. That is, we have this idea in our head for the last 50 years that building freeways is a good thing, that it helps our economy, that it helps connect places. And so therefore we should do more of it. And that's just not, it's just obviously not always the case. And oh, by the way, these things are extraordinarily expensive to build. I mean, when we start talking, over $1 billion or $2 billion for a state like Missouri, that's some very, very real money. And you have to ask yourself, where else could that money be spent? Well, on this same trip, we had the chance to stop into another small town that's not on the Katy Trail called Arrow Rock. Arrow Rock's a really charming and tiny historic village along the Missouri River. It's near the town where I went to high school in, which is called Marshall, Missouri. Arrow Rock has a lot to offer for it. Its economy, such as it exists, really does kind of, trade on tourism these days. There's really only a few hundred people that live there year round, but it's a very charming place. It has this fantastic theater that has a summer theater program where they have actors that come in from all over the country and put on performances all summer long that are really well attended and really well done. It's one of those unique things that happens in places that don't get a lot of attention, but happen all over mid-America and are really pretty cool. Well, so we pop into the coffee shop in Arrow Rock, and of course, immediately we're chatted up by two men hanging out in the coffee shop, one of whom said he was the former mayor, but then he casually admitted that basically everybody at some point in Arrow Rock becomes the mayor. So it's, he said it was really nothing special, but we talked about the Katy Trail and how we were out there. We'd done a trip. We'd spent the night in a nearby town, which meant, we spent some money there. And he said, yeah, they'd really love to have an extension that connected to the Katy Trail. And they've talked to the state about it, but it's just really hasn't ever gone anywhere. They can't really figure out how to get it done. And that really struck me. That conversation was like, the more we talked, the more we thought, oh my God, of course, Arrow Rock would be perfect to connect to the Katy Trail. It's a great destination. There's no physical reason why a connection couldn't happen. And of course I jumped on, mapping software to look at it. And there's plenty of, physical ways to get there, and make that sort of a spur happen that might connect to Arrow Rock. Maybe it goes up to Marshall and a couple other nearby towns. It connects back down to the main link. And what a great feature that would be, to bring more people into the community who might spend more money there. What's fascinating, of course, is that projects like this really are just not even on the radar of most state governments in how they think about transportation or economic development. And it's an incredible shame. We just have a system that just kind of cranks out high cost projects that don't really do anything for rural towns. So what we might say are very expensive failures that we repeat over and over and over again. And we often ignore these low cost interventions that might actually do something. They might do something really good for a lot of places and provide a different kind of economic development than what has been standard operating procedure since 1962. So again, I come back to: are we going to keep doing this? Is this system, these ideas that really were put in place 100 years ago or so, at what point do enough places say, this just doesn't work? Can't we just look around and see that these investments that we've made over and over aren't really improving the lives or fortunes of people in these communities? And we have to get creative and think of some different approaches. One of the things that I've talked about that I feel like, we could do if we had a serious conversation about helping rural communities. And by that, a serious conversation also meaning that people who live in cities like me are not condescending towards small towns and people who live in small towns. I mean, I grew up in small towns, so I don't see it that way. And I have never really understood the kind of hatred and just, even if not hatred, just a lot of the condescension people have towards rural America. These communities I grew up in were really wonderful places to live as a child. And there's an awful lot of really good things to be said about living in a small town, or especially growing up in a small town. But one of the things is that we don't often, we don't have a conversation where we lean into the positive qualities of life in small towns and really try to emphasize those. And really, when you think about it, the positive qualities are, if you want to differentiate yourself, that you're not like the big cities, that you're not striving to be a city where people get in a car and drive everywhere and commute, 20 minutes a day each way to something. And unfortunately, our smaller towns have just become like mini versions of the big cities, where our schools have been consolidated and put in locations where everybody has to drive to. The commercial development is out on the highway now, as opposed to being in the town where it used to be. The jobs are spread out all over the place, and the cities themselves have been reoriented much more around everybody getting in a car, including all the 16-year-old kids who are desperate to get a license so they can cruise around town, which certainly we did, and I think kids today still do to some degree. Instead, there's an incredible benefit by being in a place where that is not the case, where maybe people can walk to school, where people have a stronger sense of community because you're out, riding a bike, you're walking, you're seeing your neighbors, you're talking to people. You have local stores, not just the Walmart on the edge of town. And I lived through the era where people were excited to get Walmart because they were frustrated with the locally owned stores and the quality of prices of products. And it was pretty cool to, go to some place where they had maybe bigger selection and the prices were a lot cheaper. So I understand all that. But at the same time, we gutted the economy of so many towns when all that transition happened, and now you just don't have as much of even the local business community that a lot of small towns used to have. And, as a result, there's a lot of people who probably were maybe like their town, but they had more of a business mindset, had some ambition to it. And they said, you know what, I'm just going to go to a bigger city because why stay here? There's no, there's no life. There's no economy here. There's no local economy anyway. So I might as well go to a bigger place. And that's something that I think we have to really focus on and correct. I've spoken before that I think there's a historic opening right now for small towns in rural areas to capture more people and actually attract people to them. There was a pretty big shift of people moving during COVID out of cities into either suburban or exurban or rural areas. And there's a lot that's changed since certainly when I was a kid. The technology and the ability to do remote work is much better today. And I think there's just a lot of, culture change happening that small towns could benefit from. Not to mention, there's just always something nice about being near places where actual food is grown, and that's not something we may think about very much today. But who knows? Could become an issue if there are if scary trends in our world continue. Which who knows if they will or won't. But we live in a country where we don't think about food scarcity very often. But historically, that has happened, and it certainly could happen again. It's nice to be in places where you can actually grow things, and or you get to know the people who grow things. So, I think there's an incredible opportunities, but those opportunities are not going to be cashed in if our economic development minds just look at small towns as big cities in miniature. And places to, move lots of traffic, to consolidate everything into a larger and larger operation, and to spend outrageous amounts of money on things that have been proven not to work or have been proven not to really help communities grow or stabilize themselves. So again, I think this is a chance where we might look back to what was it 100 years ago that made life interesting or livable in those towns? What can be done today to mimic or at least learn from some of the success and modernize it? And so I hope we can get there. I hope at some point we can break out of these patterns on our own without being forced to. I'm not sure we will. We might just kind of keep going and doing what we're doing until the money runs out. But I hope more places can take a critical look at how they are and think about smaller investments, uh, creative solutions to today's problems that may require some work. They may require a lot of work, but could pay off with huge dividends down the line. So that's my 3 chapters for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. Have a great day.